Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Chicken Thieves. Hello there. Do you remember the time that Art Davies stopped the chicken thief activities on Grays Harbor? You should. It was one of the big law enforcement news events of 1915, and Art remembers it himself as though it happened yesterday. It was more than a man shooting at a chicken thief. Oh, much more. It was a blast of gunfire that ended an era of petty thievery that had been heavy inroads on Grays Harbor's chicken stocks. We're getting ahead of the story. You know Art Davies. Everyone knows Art. He has operated a picture and artwork store in Aberdeen since way back in the teens. He's been active in civic affairs and still is for that matter. But he's never been a member of a rifle team that I can recall, nor is he what you would call a menacing personality. But this was 1915. Now, if you recall your year, you'll remember that it was back in that era when most Grays Harbor families had their own chickens. Sure, it was common for a family living right in the heart of town to have a flock of setting hens and to keep a coop full of Bluffingford's Rhode Island Reds right handy. It provided the chicken every Sunday for their table and eggs for their table and kitchen. It stretched the pioneer's budget, and well, it was just very common, that's all. The chickens were tended with meticulous and hygienic care, and just like they get today. They got the scraps of the table and a little of what hens need to lay plenty of eggs. They had to fight with rats in their coops, which were attracted by their food and ended most good chickens in a pot and pan. But they went far to help build up the harbor city of 35 years ago. Now, some chicken raisers had pretty fancy breeds of hens. They were considerably prided in their high breed stock of some of them, and they boasted about them, and they were trotted out on occasion for Grays Harbor chicken shows. Almost every year during the teens, the county fair displayed the chicken stock augmented with at least one show in Hoquiam or Aberdeen, at which the local chicken fanciers paraded their finest. Usually, an empty store building was dressed up for the occasion, and the owners entered their pets in specially built cages in the race for the blue ribbon and prizes. The whole harbor turned out, toe to toe, to squint through the screens at the clucking and preening blue bloods and the spectacular of the fried characteristics of the various entrants. Now, Art Davies was a chicken fancier, or shall we say a chicken raiser, though he didn't raise them as a business, but rather, as most people did, as a matter of convenience, and as we now raise a pot of chives outside the back door, or a sprig of parsley in our window box. Art raised some pretty good hens too, and they did their best to keep the Davies family well supplied with big, rich eggs. The hens were in a small yard with a coop adjoining, just outside the house of the Art Building on 6th Avenue. It wasn't complete yet in 1915. Art and Mrs. Davies were building a little of it from time to time, and today it's one of the most attractively landscaped homes tucked away in the confines of Italian Gulch. But then it was not finished, and in the side yard was the chicken pen. If you recall 1915, you'll remember the trouble that the chicken raisers were having, not with the claw and beak disease or dropping of the comb, and not the premature molting or any other ailment was common or uncommon to the species, but with the midnight marauder who was getting into the chicken coops and making off with their valued stock. Many a chicken raiser went out in the morning to survey his coop and found it half emptied by parties unknown. The police had been working on it for some time. Bob Schmidt, the law enforcer, father of Ob Schmidt, Grace Harbor musician, had been climbing the waterfront for evidence of deceased farriers, and in Hoquiam, Chief Police M.C. Quinn had been keeping an eye on the residents of Shacktown, a wary nostril for the fragrant aroma of fricassee coming from there. But the corpus delicti was lacking. Not even the slightest little feather turned up. Now, back in 1915, Art Davis's house was pretty well off the beaten track. In fact, it was on the outskirts of town. And on this particular night that we're talking about, Art and Mrs. Davis retired at an unusual hour. And with the darkening of the windows, Italian Gulch seemed to settle down into a deep slumber of the hills that stood around them and above them. And the quiet of the night filled the little canyon. It was sometime after midnight that Art was awoken by a scraping sound. And sitting up in bed, he caught a glimpse of a figure climbing over the chicken yard fence. Now, many people in that position would take some thinking to decide what course of action to be taken. But Art made up his mind immediately. There was a switch in the back room that turned on the chicken lighthouse, and he reached for his .22 rifle, the one that he usually kept handy near the back door to eliminate the rats from the chicken yard. He told his wife to call the police, then turned on the light. The whole operation took only a few seconds, and when the shots of the .22 rifle broke the silence of the little gulch, the light from the chicken coop showed the athletic genius of the chicken thief. He took the 10-foot fence almost at a jump, while the shot still echoed up and down the canyon. Then Art waited. He thought that he had heard talking, but all was silence now. Yet only one of the marauders had hurdled the fence. He waited for several minutes before he ventured out, and then, carrying the gun, he walked out to the little coop. Mrs. Davis had preceded him to take a stock of all their possible loss, but she returned with a report that all the hens seemed to still be there, although several were dead and a little exhausted. And as Art walked into the chicken coop, he felt reassured, certain that the chicken thieves had taken all for the tall timber. It must have been the sight of the gun that produced the results. Whatever it was, as Art walked into the chicken house, a man leapt up from the corner with his hands in the air. "Don't shoot," he said, "don't shoot." As startled as a thief, Art hastily pointed the gun at him and ordered him to stand still. It was about that time that Joe Holzner, who knew Joe, the music maker up the gulch, Joe Holzner, showed up. He had been woken by the shot that came over to see what the excitement was all about. And the would-be chicken thief cowered between the two, cowered and talked. It was his first job, he said, the first time he had ever tried to steal a chicken. He had done it because he was hungry. While he was crouched in the corner and rolled a cigarette, he tried to talk his way out of his predicament. He said, "I said to George Thompson," but he said no man by any other name. He was a stranger, Thompson said, and they had just paired up to get a chicken to have a square meal. In a few minutes, Detective K.Y. Church arrived for the Aberdeen Police Department to take the midnight operator to the station house, and there the hungry man's pockets produced a gold watch and a meal ticket on the Butte Cafe. Art Davies particularly remembered the gold watch. Thompson offered it to him just before the officer Church arrived. He offered the watch in exchange for his freedom. "It's worth $60, he told Davies, as he tried to buy his way out of his difficulties. Well, one culprit was all that the Aberdeen police needed. In a few days, the gang of chicken thieves was cleaned up. Thomas was traced to a house along the Aberdeen waterfront where chicken bones and armfuls of feathers provided the evidence that the police needed, and they rounded up the others. Confessions that followed uncovered a gang that operated who had the taste for chicken, particularly well-bred chickens. They had robbed the roost of the harbors far and wide, and through their approach was professionalism. They had managed to keep themselves so well supplied that it was chicken every day with them, and there was the fat hen in every pot every morning. It was good news to the whole harbor. Jim Hood, who had lost several fine fat hens and some spring roosters, congratulated the police on their thorough job. Tom McKay tended his chickens with renewed interest and a feeling that they would all be there in the morning when he went out to feed them. And Art Davies, well, Art, sort of man of the week for his gunplay and his nighthawk netting, and for making the harbor safe for setting hens. We just have a few minutes left this evening, but time enough to tell you about the time card in a package shipped from Connecticut that started the hearts of Grays Harbor's eligible bachelors beating a little faster. S.A. Randolph and Jim Bowes ran an undertaking parlor in Aberdeen. They were located down just east of where the Central Drug Company is located today, and one day Randolph opened a package of silver casket handles from a factory in Connecticut to find inside a card containing an invitation for Grays Harbor men to correspond with a Connecticut girl. The card was carefully written, and the note that was plenty of unmarried and attractive young ladies in the New England state. It was reported that there were plenty of eligible bachelors in Grays Harbor. The card was embellished with a tender poem, "Think of me, though we're far apart. While others have our company, we'll always have our hearts." The card was signed with the name Kate Baines, Mabel Barker, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, Annie Fitzgerald, and Belle Dugan. They were employed, so they noted, at the factory in Wallingford, Connecticut. Now, letters tossed up by the sea in bottles, and mysterious valentines, unsigned, classified ads, and names carved in the bark of trees, all have their lure of mystery, romance, and adventure, and this fell into that same category. Randolph told the story and turned the card over to the newspaper reporter, and the young man wrote a yarn about the coincidence. And then he was prepared to forget it. But Randolph found that he couldn't forget. He was bombarded by telephone calls requesting the names of the factory girls who had wrote the letter. He had letters and cards requesting the names, and if a number of interested in the addresses was an indication, a lot of mail went out of Grays Harbor, addressed to 5 young ladies in Wallingford, who took the unique method to introduce themselves to Grays Harbor. I'd like to tell you that all 5 of them married Grays Harbor men and came west to settle down, and that they lived right here today, but actually I can't trace them. And if any of the correspondence did produce a romance, or any of the 5 came to Grays Harbor today, I would like to hear of it. But we do have a note to add to the story. The Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce in that era took up the promotion and sent them literature on Aberdeen as a future home, and he advised that he considered it a primary promotion with the object to increase the population of the city and to advertise it far and wide as places where bachelors were eligible, if not more eligible than anywhere else. And as such, we recorded tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.